Hey everyone, and welcome back to our second company deep dive. If you missed our first one on Take-Two Interactive and what they're doing, which honestly is very interesting, then that video will be linked down below. There of course will be more of these, so if you're interested in the state of this industry over time, hit that sub button, and with that said, let's go. EA have had a quiet 2020 so far, having, well, wound down more projects than they've announced. Aside from a couple of remasters and their usual annual sporting releases, EA's most significant upcoming project is, drumroll, support for Google Stadia, of all things. All other substantial projects are either too far along in the pipeline to factor into this year's releases, or are still to be announced by the company. So, with such a prolific bunch of people being so eerily quiet, we've really got to ask, what is actually going on with EA? Yep, that's the question we'll be diving into today, and if you're in the market for, daily news and some associated cool loot, then please check out our Patreon page via the link in the video description. Seriously helps us out, and with that, let's get into the meat of this video. EA announced that both of their flagship non-sports titles, Star Wars Battlefront 2 and Battlefield 5, would be winding down new content. Battlefront 2's final update came in the form of its Battle for Scarif, and going forward, DICE are going to be focusing only on maintaining the servers plus events and challenges, but key there, no new content. Battlefield 5 similarly will receive its final update in June. The reason here is really quite simple. It's to funnel resources into Battlefield 2021, to really put all of DICE onto that. EA have indicated that they've got no rush to meet the next-gen launch window, and instead that they want to take their time. That's for two reasons. Number one, tech, and number two, for the player bases to actually grow. So yes, BF 2021. Now, Battlefield 5 had a troubled existence. I would say great core gameplay mechanics, but too little content, too many bugs, and a lack of clear direction. The game ended up being a live service experiment that seemingly, I would say, neither worked for EA or its players. The announcement that June's update will be its last, and that it won't actually be a full chapter, does feel more like development for that game has been abandoned rather than completed, as it was with, say, Battlefront 2. And that's especially the case with Russia not being featured, or, say, the reclamation, the liberation of Europe, which really those two things would have been needed for this to have actually filled its promise of being the World War II Battlefield, sort of tracking it from start to finish. It really is so different to Battlefront 2, despite its controversial launch, really did manage to turn itself around. Years of support and then new content based off various aspects of the Star Wars canon actually did make that game a real comeback story for DICE, and because of that, you would perhaps expect them to then be working on a Battlefront 3. But that's actually not something that's on the cards. BF2's design director said back in September that the hunger for sequels just isn't really there with people. But of course that was before Star Wars had a bit of a resurgence with Fallen Order and Mandalorian. Less Jedi, a bit less so. Fallen Order, though, that topped 10 million unique players, which certainly is a success. So while it is clear that EA are maybe reprioritizing DICE's resources to BF6, Battlefield 6, yeah, it does seem like Star Wars is still something that is going strong for them. So yes, for their core games, EA, having shuttered two of their games to free up resources, are now planning to go hard on the next Battlefield installment. And you know what? It's an almost uncharacteristic amount of long-term thinking from EA. So that does lead us to think then, what about the short term? What does that actually look like? Well, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order did actually receive New Game Plus DLC that's also got challenge maps plus an editor for them and cosmetics, which actually is pretty darn strong. But right now, we're not really sure if there will be narrative DLC. And to be honest, I do suspect that any narrative content there will likely be saved for what's likely, I'd say, a very far off sequel, maybe, 2022. Now, BioWare are also working on Anthem 2.0, but they have been quiet as of late, so a 2020 release for that doesn't appear to be on the cards, unless maybe, EA Play announces something for Anthem, or maybe EA Play announces like something else from BioWare in this calendar year. A part of that actually could be possible, but we'll save that for later. Now, last year's Plants vs. Zombies Battle for Neighborville, that seems to have performed perfectly fine, though I doubt it's going to make much of a blip in this year, while Need for Speed Heat was, a bit strange because it apparently was pretty good, managed to avoid the bad MTX of past entries, and was actually the franchise's best-selling entry on this generation of consoles. although I can't imagine that was that much of a high bar. But still, for their efforts, Ghost Games, who made Heat, have since lost lead of the franchise, with Criterion now returning to take the lead there, which could bode well for its future health. But this still does leave EA with a very empty 2020 besides Apex Legends, The Sims, and their sports games. They really could be at a risk of just not having a major release in this calendar year whatsoever. So back in January, the earnings call pointed to 4 new sports titles, 4 titles that draw from the breadth of EA's IP, and then 4 titles published globally for smaller developers. Well, time has passed, and we now actually know a fair bit more. So FIFA and NFL 21 are going to launch in Q2, with NHL 21 being in Q3. Now, NBA is a bit up in the air because there's not an NBA 20, but VentureBeat reported that they actually do want to get something out to compete with NBA 2K. So there's that. Then, of course, there is a possibility of a UFC 4. But past that, the 4 titles that they talked about in January, well, they appear to be Burnout Paradise Remastered, Command and Conquer Remastered, then their Medal of Honor virtual reality title that they're doing with Oculus, and then 1 additional EA HD title. And on that, well, we might have actually just got some breaking news, so yes, more on that later in this video. So, what about those other titles then? A lot has been made of EA's tendency to cancel projects, particularly when it comes to, well, a pretty long line of cancelled Star Wars titles. But one of those titles does seem to be alive, though. A smaller, more experimental game being developed by EA Motive, which is presumably the repeatedly leaked Project Maverick. Again, there's basically no idea of when we're actually going to see that, but we do know that's a project that's in the works. Now, if we go back to BioWare, they apparently do have something in the works beyond just the resurrection of Anthem via its 2.0 update. Back in September, a developer mentioned the studio having several other big projects in the works, and that they are mostly super secret right now. One such project, though, has a large and growing team in Edmonton, which was in pre-production at the time that that update was posted. So the wording that the Dread Wolf rises, I mean, that's an overt tease for Dragon Age 4, which still, of course, does appear to be quite some time off indeed. What are BioWare's other projects? I mean, the studio's reputation certainly has taken a beating in recent years, and it definitely could use some salvaging. Well, there's actually some interesting news here, because according to VentureBeat, that extra EA HD title that we mentioned earlier is actually a HD remaster of the Mass Effect trilogy, one that might even get a Switch launch after its initial release, so I think that's pretty major. Now, BioWare do actually have a new Mass Effect game in production under the lead of Mike Gamble, but past that, well, we already know, of course, that there's like a new Dragon Age in the works, but there's really not that much information there. I would expect, of course, Dragon Age 4 to come out first, with Mass Effect being after that, but both of those titles being quite some time away indeed. Indeed, on that topic, with sort of out-and-out new releases really looking thin on the ground, EA could instead be relying on remasters to carry them through 2020. Their website's coming soon section currently only lists 2 games, both of which are remasters. One is Command & Conquer Remastered that is due out in this June, while the other is a Switch port of the 2-year-old remaster of Burnout Paradise. EA have promised, quote, exciting remasters of fan favorites beyond these 2, but what those actually are, I mean, right now that is anyone's guess. There are rumors of SSX Tricky remaster actually being a thing. That's somewhat spurred on by one of the series' producers' admission that it could work, but then again, we don't know for sure. Nothing's actually been confirmed there. Now, as for that Command & Conquer remaster, it's an interesting one. It's perhaps the high point of EA's year, at least for me as a gamer. The game is actually helmed by Petroglyph Games. Now, they were formed by key members of the original Command & Conquer team from Westwood. So that's at least one project that actually does appear to be getting the love, the care, the attention that it actually deserves. Everything we've seen so far does actually look to put that on par with the recent Age of Empires remasters in terms of its quality, rather than being another, Warcraft 3 Reforged style situation, or maybe like what they've done with the mobile Command & Conquer in the past. The less said about that, the better. Of course, though, EA do have their sports titles. While generally ignored by many of us sort of core gamers, EA have historically relied on the likes of FIFA and Madden for consistency in their earnings. Even still, things have changed in recent years. EA Sports is down to only 5 active titles. They actually had double that a decade ago. So only FIFA, Madden, and NHL are on track for release this year. NBA Live, as we said, is skipping 2020, while UFC 4 could arrive late in this year. It actually still doesn't have a release date, and we haven't really heard anything about it since last year. Now, the interesting thing with UFC 4 is it's actually the final game in EA's contract with the UFC, so if they fail to secure an extension, that'll be another sports IP that could be missing in the coming years. Andrew Wilson did recently say that they want to invest more in sports and to actually bring in new games, potentially even bringing in college sports titles. Now, as for golf, well, 2K actually just got the PGA Tour license, so I think that's probably something that is just off the cards for EA. Now, leaving sports, there are also EA Originals and EA Partners, so we could see something from Velen Studios, announce that maybe EA Play 2020. There then, of course, is EA Originals, which could yield even more this year. I mean, of course, last year's EA Play did have 3 originals be announced, so it does stand to reason that EA would have something going on with, I guess, that vertical of their business in this year as well. As it stands then, EA's most significant recent news is that half-hearted support for Google Stadia. And I almost think this is better for Stadia than it is for EA. I mean, I just can't imagine there being much substance to EA's thinking there beyond maybe kickstarting their streaming presence with that. I mean, like, hey, why not? They've got the content, and I'm sure their studios and, of course, the Frostbite engine would benefit from that foray if they're interested in streaming anyway. And while I'll admit that, yes, this Stadia part, like, that's the bit that most of us find boring, well, it does actually make up part of a broader plan for EA to bring their content to more digital distribution platforms. This is actually something Andrew Wilson talked about during their recent earnings call, where he also mentioned the Nintendo Switch, so they want to have multiple titles on the Switch, I think that's quite interesting, and then also them improving their support for Steam by bringing their Origin Access subscription service over to that. And I mean, it's interesting, right? I've got to wonder what those Switch games are, because I imagine that, Frostbite will be tricky, so I think the remasters would fit on the Switch really well, so Mass Effect and Burnout. Apex on the Switch, I mean, that would be an interesting way to get another angle on Warzone, but that sure as hell would be a monster of a porting job, so I don't envy whatever technical team would be faced with doing that. So, are EA in trouble? It's kind of difficult to say. Anthem was meant to be a big Destiny-like franchise for them, so you'd think that its failure would have stung, but I mean, their financials, they did survive its sort of death well enough. For this year, it just doesn't seem like there's going to be that much major, and that they really are focusing on the long-term prospects as they move into the next generation. That does mean that, yes, the short-term looks rather bleak for them, but I actually suspect that they've made the right move in not scrambling for a stacked 2020. Given their number of recent failures, right, there's just not that much else they could do. I mean, if BF5 and Anthem weren't total washes, and perhaps both, actually could have been vibrant live services right now through 2020, then that would have been great. And maybe that was EA's original plan, one that of course did fail, with them really just not being able to do anything quick enough to fill in that 2020 gap. I mean, if you think about it, right, a Battlefield that would spend 2020, going to Russia, having the liberation of Europe, having that plus a vibrant Anthem in addition to Apex, that would have been a decent lineup, even though it would have been no major releases. Though it's funny, circumstance might give EA a bit of a pass this year. They might be behind, but actually so is everyone else. EA's lack of an immediate project pipeline kind of might just slip by because of that. Apex Legends is performing well, but of course Warzone will undoubtedly provide very stiff competition, and let's be real, a new iteration of their savior, FIFA Ultimate Team, is on the horizon, right? That is going to make a lot of money for them, especially since, at least for now, it's going to fly by regulators in the most important markets. Now, on that note, it will be very interesting to see how this year's just wave of sports games actually sell. I mean, if a second wave of the stuff that leads to less retail being open, like, GameStop's being closed, then I could imagine they could take a minor hit, because I suspect that the less core audience who are more into sports games would be a bit slower to take up digital. But actually, let's just talk about that march into digital, because if anything, well, that's being hastened by people not being able to go outside and actually purchase games. And I think that's really important, because this will have got more people actually used to purchasing digital games. And this is super important for, well, not just EA, for every single publisher. The reason being that, guess what? it's more efficient for them, okay? So if you are selling a game via retail, there's distribution fees, there's retail fees, there's just more people in that waterfall taking out their cut. So you can actually get less sales, but a way higher share of the profits if it's just sold digitally, either through your platform, Origin, or with a 70-30 split through, say, the Sony or Microsoft Xbox stores. So that's something that's going to be, I'd say, pretty good for the games industry in general, that shift digital. Of course, for customers, yeah, it's going to disrupt pre-owned and things like that, which for the console space will be a little bit of a change from what they've been used to. Then there's also, of course, DICE LA, and we've not really mentioned them that much in this video because there's not been much news, but we do actually know that Vince Zampella of Respawn had been advising them heavily, so I would imagine they're working on, longer-term projects for EA. Now, of course, them leading their own projects, that is going to be tricky for Battlefield because they often would support its DLC releases, but it's totally a possibility that they're going and doing something new. Then more into the future for EA in general, there's a Fallen Order sequel, that'll probably be 2022, and then there's also Maverick, which is reportedly leaning a bit more heavily into the space combat, and I mean, with that, there's plenty to build off from Battlefield, or Battlefront 2, but of course, Battlefront 2's flight was by Criterion, not EA Motive. But still, personally, having loved Rogue Squadron and Starfighter, I'm actually quite excited to see what Maverick could actually be. So overall, I'd say it's good that EA are taking a long-term approach to things, and if you actually are to sort of scry ahead a few years and think about what a best-case scenario would look like for them, well, I think it would be pretty clear. It would be Battlefield 6 actually being successful, learning its lessons, and then Anthem 2.0 actually being pretty decent. That would then give EA the situation I think they wish they had right now, where they would have 3 vibrant live services for the core market. Right now, they've got Apex Legends. Probably doing well, probably having a pretty hard time with Warzone, being honest, but, if they actually had Battlefield and Anthem holding the fort there, then they would be able to have in their core market what they have in their sports market. Sports, for them, has really given a lot of money, but importantly, stability and growth, right, through Ultimate Team and things like that. Whereas if you actually look at EA's core offerings, BioWare have been all over the place. Battlefield has been all over the place. There's things like Medal of Honor, which they totally messed up, that are now dead. You've got the likes of Visceral, that of course were shuttered. Their core market has just been all over the place. So a best case scenario, I think, would see them stabilize their core market through the establishment of Battlefield and Anthem as viable live services, of course going along with Apex, and then any new BioWare IP or Respawn Entertainment IP actually doing well. If they can get their core market to be as strong as their sports market, I think they'll be absolutely on to incredible earnings and probably a lot of stock growth as the future goes on. However, if that doesn't happen, then the worst case scenario for EA is really not that good because, right, if Anthem 2.0 fails, then that will be really, really, really bad. Now, then there's the rest of BioWare's IP. That is just a little bit up in the air. Maybe it'll be good, maybe it won't be. Right now, we just can't really tell. So that Anthem situation is a large risk. Then Battlefield 6. I mean, yeah, if that fails to actually learn and it just does a BF5 again, they will solidify the losses that they earned during Battlefield 5. That will be really bad, especially because their shooter portfolio will, at that point, be less diversified than it is now. Because, of course, right now, they have the floundering Battlefield 5, but they've also had Battlefront 2. So without that, they'll really struggle. Now, yes, in maybe 2 to 3 years, a new Jedi Fallen Order game will probably do well for them. There's whatever EA Motive are working on. But I think you can see how with those like core franchises, those core IPs, if they don't really go that well, I think they could be in for a bit of a struggle. Then on the sports side, that's an interesting one. I think that's going to continue doing very well into the future. The only thing for them is regulation. So if a lot of the larger markets, like say the UK and Europe for FIFA, I know the FIFA games are massive in our region of the world. I've got no idea what FIFA is like in the USA because I don't think soccer's that big over there. But say Madden, right? If those games, if those actually get exposed to regulation via, it would basically mean the definition of gambling being shifted in a whole bunch of regions, and it would have to be shifted so that it's not about the withdrawal of currency, but it's the earning of an item that has a similar value in the eye of the person who is earning it. So if that regulatory legal change happens, then that massively exposes those games to regulation and really would hurt their earnings potential. So that is a massive risk factor. However, there is so much money going on there across the entire industry and across mobile as well, that I highly doubt we're going to see any meaningful change there in terms of what I think a lot of core gamers want to see happen. I don't think that's going to happen, maybe in the next 10 years. I think the most you're going to get is enhanced labeling and maybe enhanced parental controls. I think at worst, for EA's perspective, that would have a minor dent, but I don't think it would really have a material impact to their finances. So overall, there you go. That's the outlook for EA. It could go very good, right? If they can stabilize their core offerings. It could also really flounder if they continue to have the success rate with their core games that they've had up to now, which has been spotty at best. I would love to know, though, where do you think EA are going? Do you think, are you bullish or bearish on EA? Do actually let me know. I'll be reading the comments. And if you want to support more content like this that is taking a step back from the news cycle, sort of kicking it into analysis business mode, then hey, the Patreon's a great way to help us. You can get some physical loot, like here's some of last month's stuff. There's the pin from a while ago, so you can get some physical loot, and also the daily briefing where our news team just boils everything down into one post, gives it to you so that you basically can keep up to date with the gaming news in a super fast fashion. Or of course, subscribing and liking really does help us a lot as well. So thank you for watching this video. Let me know what you think about EA, and I'll catch you next time.